What's a body gotta do?
What? The U.S. Constitution has been able to last over 200 years because it actually has the ability to change and adapt with the times. There are 6 different ways in which the Constitution can be changed. There are formal amendments, which are the usual ones that you hear about, the 27, but then there's also informal amendments. Judicial interpretation, legislation, executive changes, customs, and party practices are all informal amendments. Article 5 of the Constitution provides the methods for changing the Constitution. This is known as the amendment process. In this process, a section of text is added to the end of the document, which changes something already in the document, or it makes a totally new rule. This revision or addition to the Constitution is a formal amendment. There are 27 amendments that have been successfully added. So, formal amendments, these are the ones you typically hear about. Physical changes to the Constitution, written down. There are actually 4 ways that we can change the Constitution formally. Each one's a 2-step process. The first part of the process is proposal. So this is when the amendment is actually brought up, and then there's ratification when it's approved. Each method demonstrates the principle of federalism. So amendments have to be proposed at the national level, but then they're ratified at the state level. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. This establishes civil liberties of the citizens and limits the power of the federal government. And the remaining amendments were individually added over time. So when they first started the Constitution, they already added on the first 10 amendments, already making changes. But then over time, we've individually added some more onto there. Next up, we have informal amendments. So formal were actual changes to the Constitution, but these do not actually change or add any wording to the Constitution itself. So they're not physical. We just sort of know that they're there. They can result from any 5 sources. So there's judicial interpretation, legislation, executive changes, customs, and party practices. These are all ways that we informally change how we look at the Constitution. Again, not written down. Judicial interpretation is the first way we can informally change the Constitution. The courts, especially the Supreme Court, have been largely responsible for making changes to the Constitution. Supreme Court rulings help to explain a part of the Constitution, and they interpret if the actions of the government are unconstitutional. They have an effect on the Constitution by deciding how it's interpreted. So an example of this might be the ruling where the Supreme Court decided that it was perfectly okay to burn the American flag because of the First Amendment, which gives us the right to free speech. So if you're protesting and you burn the American flag, you can't be arrested because that's protected under the First Amendment. So we didn't make changes. We didn't add any new amendments on. It just sort of changed how we view the First Amendment and how we apply it. Congress changes the Constitution by passing laws. These laws can clarify details about the way the government works or interprets part of the Constitution. So an example of this would be if Congress passed a law that changed the structure of the Postal Service. It would further explain the part of the Constitution that gives it the right to establish post offices. So we're not taking away that right, we're not adding anything on, we've just created a law that changes how we look at the right to establish post offices. The next way to informally amend the Constitution is through executive action. Presidents can also make changes to the Constitution by how they interpret what the Constitution says about their powers and the actions they take. An example of this is when a president makes an executive agreement with the leader of another nation. Technically, Congress has the constitutional authority to make treaties, but this takes a lot of time. So sometimes presidents will just make their own agreements. Some people think this is unconstitutional. There's actually been a lot of argument surrounding that topic, but this is a way that we can informally interpret how we use the Constitution. Another one is customs. So various practices of how the government does things have become customs that are not necessarily outlined in the Constitution. For example, the president appoints a cabinet or a group of experts to advise him on important issues. The Constitution doesn't call for this. There's nothing about the cabinet in it at all, but this has become a customary practice. As the government got bigger, we realized the president had a lot of jobs and he needed some advisors, or she. So now we need the cabinet, even though it's not written down. And the final way to informally amend the Constitution is through party practices. The Constitution does not mention political parties, nor does it mention anything about their structure or function, but they greatly affect the actions of Congress and the president today. So nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about Republicans or Democrats, yet they have a big role in our government. So as an overview, formal amendments are written additions to the Constitution. These are the 27 that you guys are going to need to memorize, written down. Informal amendments are not written down, not added to the Constitution. Things like judicial interpretation, legislation, executive changes, customs, and party practices. So make sure you know the difference between those two. It's definitely going to be key in your future assessments coming up.